Good evening and welcome. I'm Stephen Barber. I'm Assistant Dean in Business and Management faculty here at Regent, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's event. First of all, I would like to thank the Senior European Experts Forum for their work in organising what I think promises to be a really stimulating evening tonight, and also to thank them for their long association with Regents. I think in particular Regents would like to thank Lord Hannay for his connection with the university, and we're very proud that he is one of our senior honorary fellows. You'll all know that at Regents we encourage debate and we engage in thought leadership, and to that end I'm really pleased to see so many people here tonight and hopefully doing exactly that. The topic's one which I think should interest us all. Is the world economy heading for a crash in 2020? Well, I think by 7:30 we'll know the answer to that. And to get us there, I think we have some really wonderful speakers. First of all, Lord David Hannay will introduce the paper which has been published to accompany this event. You can see on the screen here. Lord Hannay, as you will know, is a former ambassador of the UK to the EEC, former ambassador to the UN. He served as special representative for Cyprus, a member of the UN High-Level Panel on Threats, Challenges and Change, reporting to the Secretary General. He's currently chair of the All-Party Group on Global Security and Non-Proliferation. He's a member of the top-level group of UK parliamentarians for multilateral nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Following that, Dr. Rebecca Harding will reflect on the macroeconomic picture. Dr. Harding is an independent economist. She specialises in trade and trade finance. She's CEO of Corollis Technologies. She's a co-author of two acclaimed publications, The Weaponization of Trade and Gaming Trade, and is a frequent contributor to radio and television. She advises the Council of the Society of Professional Economists, is a former chief economist of the British Bankers Association and the Work Foundation. Correct me if I get any of this wrong. She was founder and CEO of Delta Economics, CEO of Equant Analytics, fellow of the Offenberg Institute for Trade and Innovation, and has been special advisor to the Treasury Select Committee and chief economic advisor to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Entrepreneurship. So I think she'll know the answer. To reflect on banking and finance, our third speaker is our very own Dr. Elias Bukrami. He's head of programs here at Regents, leading our courses in finance, energy and trade. His team was awarded the 2014 Trustees Prize for Outstanding Service to Regents University. 2018, he won a double award of Excellence in Teaching and Learning and the Prize in Leadership and Management. Dr. Bukrami is a post-Keynesian financial economist. He believes that economic output is demand-driven and focuses his research in this area as Associate Director of Regent's Transnational Centre for Business and Management. He's a visiting professor at the University of Lyon in France and a member of the Strategic Advisory Board, and he also appears regularly in the press and media. So I think we're in for a real treat. There will of course be an opportunity at the end for questions and discussions, so note anything that you want to put to the panel. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to hand over proceedings to Lord Hannay.
Well, thank you, Stephen, very much for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here at the beginning of a new academic year's contribution by the Senior European Experts Group. We do 3 of these seminars per year. Then we will be doing another one, I hope, in February on Brexit. I promise you it's the only time tonight I'm going to mention that word. But we will be doing one then and one in the early spring on a subject which we haven't yet agreed with the university. But this one is, we decided, was with the Vice-Chancellor and others, it was a worthwhile question to pose. Now, the paper that my group, has circulated to you is almost exclusively about trade policy. Not because we think that the whole answer to the question, is there going to be a crash, is trade policy. It's not, obviously, and others who are following me will speak about the financial market, the macroeconomic, and also the trade policy issues as well. But it is, I think, an important and critical part of trying to find an answer, and of course it will not surprise you that I think none of us will actually give you a clear yes or no to that question that has been posed. But I hope we will give some indications as to what you need to be watching out for. Now, why the paper we wrote heavily concentrated on trade policy, I think partly was to answer the question, why does world trade and the rules governing it matter so much? Why should we think that it is an essential part of answering the question? Well, the weight of historical analysis, I would suggest, certainly attributes a substantial role to trade protectionism in bringing about that absolutely drastic shrinkage in world trade and world economic growth in the 1930s, known as the slump. That attribution of trade protectionism, often referred to in shorthand by those not too very well known American senators called Smoot and Hawley, the Smoot-Hawley Act, which triggered that off, but was then followed by a lot of other people putting up protectionist barriers, did make a huge contribution to the disastrous slump, and of course, by doing so, to a number of the political consequences that flowed from high unemployment, hopeless lack of growth, and all the ills that went with that. Now, that after all, it was that experience which explained why after the Second World War, all the policymakers worldwide attached so much importance to not allowing that to happen again. And that was what led to the establishment of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, known as GATT, in 1948, and to a succession of trade liberalization negotiations thereafter, Dillon, Kennedy, Tokyo, and Uruguay being the shorthand names that were given to them, and which all went in the same direction. They basically went in the direction of rolling back the 1930 era protectionism, which was very often, of course, by that time enshrined in domestic law in countries that really mattered to trade, like the United States, but also the UK and other countries around the world, Japan obviously. So the direction of policy by those who'd been seared in the experience of the 1930s was quite firmly that trade protectionism had to be rolled back. And they were quite remarkably successful at doing that. Those rounds of negotiations which I've described were hard work. They each of them lasted for 7 or 10 years to bring to fruition, but they did result in lowering tariffs, removing quantitative restrictions, accepting a whole number of rules, and most interestingly, probably of all, at the end of the Uruguay round, which was the most recent of them, because alas, its successor, the Doha round, has not been brought to success, and it's not look as if it will be. But the Uruguay round in the mid-1990s led to something really quite startling, which was the setting up of the World Trade Organization, which, unlike the GATT, was treaty-based, and which contained within it a set of dispute settlement procedures, which were binding on the members of the GATT, which was by that time, of course, practically the whole world, because whereas the GATT had started off like the IMF, more or less a Western institution, with the end of the Cold War, there was a huge rush, and a lot of countries that had been held back by their Soviet or Chinese sponsors, as it were, came dashing in, including China and including, finally, Russia as well. And so it became a global institution, and they are therefore bound by this dispute settlement procedure, which is fairly astonishing in itself because it's just about the only one in all the international rules which actually binds the members to accept the rulings of a tribunal, an international tribunal. All the things that you're told people will never accept were accepted in the setting up of the WTO. They are now, of course, being challenged. And that was why also, when the post-World War II world went through two quite serious economic and financial crises, the first, of course, in the 1970s, after the Yom Kippur War and the quadrupling of the oil price, which led to very high inflation, high unemployment, huge stress on all the politicians. And they said, we're not going to go back to protectionism to save our bacon. And interestingly enough, they said exactly the same in 2008, 2009, when, of course, there was a huge financial crisis and leading into an economic crisis. But again, all the policymakers took a firm view that they must not seek remedies through protectionism, through breaking the rules that have been laid down by the World Trade Organization. And although, of course, there were around the edges one or two peccadilloes, obviously some people slipped back a bit, but there was no major shift back towards protectionism. That didn't come until Donald Trump was elected President of the United States in 2016. And since then, it has been coming hard and fast. And that is a reason, I think, to be pretty concerned. Now, the other reason is that although you can argue quite a lot, and economists, I'm sure, will argue quite a lot, about the cause and effect between the liberalization of trade, the freeing up of trade, making it fairer, and economic growth, I don't think there are terribly many who would argue there was no link at all. And so the long periods of steady economic growth which occurred between 1945 and 2015 or even up to the present day have owed a great deal, I believe myself, to this benign climate of trade policy. And it's also led to one of the facts which is most startling, which is that nobody noticed. It was rather like Adam Smith's hidden hand. It was there working and helping economic growth, but nobody realized that it was the benign direction in which trade policy was moving steadily through all these rounds, which was helping bring that about. Now, that, of course, has ceased. Now, since 2016, we're no longer, that's no longer the world we live in. And I hope our paper will have given you some of the history, but also the analysis that I've just spoken about. Because the leader of the world's biggest economy, Donald Trump, seems to believe that trade has to be balanced bilaterally between the United States and each of its 193 trade partners, which I'm sure those of you who study economics will know is not a very fashionable view. But he believes that, seems to believe that, though I am struck sometimes by the fact that he clearly believes it in respect of China, but he hasn't noticed that he's been making, by the acts he's been taking against the Chinese, the US trade deficit with Vietnam much bigger. It is just a silly way of proceeding, frankly, and hopefully one day everyone will understand that. He also seems to believe, and there equally I would say I think he's very badly wrong, that trade wars are easy and quick to win. All history demonstrates that that is not in fact so, and we are now living through an experience of that, and I think he himself has begun to understand, though not to change policy, to understand that the sort of trade wars which he has triggered off, they may be capable of being settled on what I call slightly spurious grounds, like the renegotiated NAFTA, I've forgotten what it's called now, with Mexico and Canada. But the big event that he's unleashed with China is not going to be like that at all. So we are in a period when the benign rounds have run out of steam, where the system is being challenged. Even the dispute settlement system for WTO is being challenged by a really rather underhand approach, which is the Americans are refusing to allow judges or panelists to be appointed to the dispute settlement arrangements, which eventually, not too long far ahead, could render them inoperable. And that would be pretty disastrous if that happened. I hope that a way will be found of it not happening. Now, we also can see that the growth in economic growth, which I would suggest to you has been sustained quite strongly by benign trade policies, is also showing signs of being affected adversely by the trade wars and by the attempts to balance trade bilaterally. And you've already heard from the Director General of the IMF and the Secretary General of the OECD, both people who know a lot about these things, warning that trade policy is really dangerous position, is not in a good place at the moment as a result of what has been going on, principally triggered off by the new trade policy of President Trump. And that warning doesn't seem to have got through to a lot of people, but it does really need to. Because if I had to say which part of the rules-based international order, that rather dreadful phrase we all use without quite perhaps explaining often enough what it really means, that the part of the world, the rules-based international order that is most at risk is the part that deals with trade policy. The most immediately at risk is the part that deals with trade policy, and the WTO is, of course, the embodiment of that. So I think this means that it's a big challenge for countries who don't think, like Donald Trump, that trade needs to be balanced bilaterally, who don't believe that trade wars are easy to win and quite fun. It's a big challenge to them to hold the line. Now, there are plenty of them who feel that way. The whole of the European Union, of course, including ourselves, but also people like the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Southeast Asians, the Latin Americans, the Africans who are just in the process of trying to open up their own markets and hopefully, and I would think rightly, will be given even better access to the European market when they do so. There is a huge mass of the countries who are in the WTO who do not think that way. So they've got to work together, I would hope, to pull together to stop the dismantling of the system and to ensure that when the US trade policy shifts, as it will at some stage shift, though not necessarily easily or very fast back in the direction of liberalization, that there is something there to be saved. Now, in the 1930s, there was nothing there to be saved by the time it had all gone over. Nothing. It had all gone. The free trade, which had been such a feature before the First World War, had pretty well disappeared. And as I've explained to you, it took about 60 years after the Second World War to roll back that protectionism and to get actually into an even better place than we'd been in the Victorian era, because then there were no dispute settlement procedures, although there was a lot freer trade than there was in the 1930s. So that is the essence of what our paper is drawing your attention to, and it's why think the answer to the question I would give to will there be a crash in 2020, well, let's leave the 2020 bit of it out because it's not terribly easy to be sure. But do I think that the way trade policy has been developing in the last couple of years is leading us closer to a place where a crash could take place of really damaging kind? Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. I'd like to continue the theme on trade wars, if I may. I promise that I too will try and stay clear of the word Brexit, although I am going to mention it just a little bit. Sorry, indulge me. But I'm very much of the view that what happens, correctly, 2020, not necessarily, but over the coming months and years, the thing that's threatening the system at the moment is indeed trade policy, but not the economics of trade policy. And what I want to do today is give you an idea of why I actually think the politics of trade policy is more important than the economics at this stage. Now, there are a lot of things going on in the global economy at the moment. The IMF loves the word headwinds. I, as an economist, if I hear the word headwinds anymore, I shall probably scream. It's a phrase that doesn't really mean very much. But there are pressures in the global economy at the moment. Global trade didn't pick up in 2018 to the extent that we were expecting it to by any means. It caught up by, I think it grew by about 1.8 or 2%. We haven't seen that relationship between trade growth and GDP growth that we would have expected since the financial crisis. So we had 2 years after the financial crisis where trade growth was roughly double GDP growth. And that is the long-term trajectory that the World Trade Organization has always expected to happen. That's the kind of relationship between trade and GDP that most economists would expect. That hasn't actually happened properly since 2012. So we haven't seen a relationship between GDP and trade growth where trade has actually been higher than GDP growth for that period of time. It caught up a little bit in 2017, but because we've had a collapse in oil prices and because we've had trade tensions since then, world trade has never triggered the GDP growth, the sort of, if you like, the escalation or the acceleration rate that we would have expected. So trade is absolutely critical to all of this. Why? And this, I think, is something, we were talking about politicians beforehand, I think it's something that people don't get explained to them often enough. Trade is just what businesses do. It's how businesses interact with one another. So of course it's linked to GDP growth because it's how businesses interact with each other. And actually it's businesses that trade, not governments. And so for the first time in my career as a trade economist, I can actually look at the evidence now and say it is politics that is affecting this economics. You know, the economics would be fine if it weren't for the politicians at the moment. So let's have a think about what else is going on. And I think there are some other things that are going on as well, some of which are part and parcel with the legacy of the global financial crisis, and some of which are actually things that are directly related to the trade wars and the uncertainties that we're seeing at the moment. So we've seen a massive expansion in China. And we've seen a massive expansion with China's growth in its debt as well. There was a report just yesterday that said that consumer indebtedness in China was 60% of 60% level of consumer indebtedness relative to GDP. There's also a huge amount of indebtedness that runs into trillions going across the whole Belt and Road initiative. So what the Chinese have done is taken out a lot of investment against the places where they've invested, or a lot of loans against the places where they've invested, which is why ports in Sri Lanka have been affected, why Pakistan has been affected. So there is a lot of emerging market debt that is in the global economy. Why does that matter? It matters because while the US dollar is strong, and that has been the story of the post-financial crisis, that emerging market debt is very significant because it's expensive to repay unless emerging economies are growing rapidly in terms of trade. Their growth has slowed down, trade has slowed down, and worse than that, we're actually seeing the use of currency manipulation as a tool for coercing, say the Turkish government at the moment, because President Trump has actually said he will destroy Turkey economically. In other words, he will create a crisis where the debt needs to be repaid. So there is a lot of politicization of this debt as well. And we saw a couple of weeks ago Germany narrowly avoided recession. Germany's an interesting economy. I could bore for England on the subject, so please excuse me if I go on a bit about this. But Germany is an interesting example of an economy that's completely affected by the trade environment. So when trade slows down, Germany slows down, and when trade picks up, Germany picks up. What's interesting though at the moment, and this is one of my reasons for being an optimist about Europe, is that demand in Germany is very strong. So whether we see Germany actually go into a full-blown recession over the next 18 months, I think it's debatable. However, we are seeing a big trade consequence and trade impact on German growth. Mexico is also slowing, and there was a piece on Bloomberg yesterday that argued that because Mexico is slowing, that's often a predictor of the US slowing as well. But the US economy and US demand actually doesn't seem to be showing that amount of weakness, although there is a spat going on between Jay Powell and Donald Trump about which direction interest rates should be heading in, and a suggestion that rates should turn negative. I think all of this is a little worrying, because what it shows is a degree of misunderstanding about where a lot of the politics is impacting on economics. Because we can't ignore trade wars. Trade is slowing in China because there's a huge amount of uncertainty about where China's growth is going to come from if it isn't coming from trade. Demand has picked up in China. China has been undergoing massive structural reform since the financial crisis, particularly since 2012-13 when Xi came to power. But the problem is that by targeting particular sectors of the Chinese economy, it's shunting supply chains around the region, and that's creating problems for the Chinese economy. Ironically, as Lord Haney said, it's actually promoting trade in some of the other parts of emerging Asia, so particularly Vietnam. But what trade wars are doing, over and above everything else, is creating a degree of uncertainty in the global economy where companies are reluctant to invest. They're not sure about where things are going. And so the level of indebtedness, because there's not actually the business-led, investment-led impetus, the level of indebtedness in households and by governments is increasing. And if I wanted to add to misery on top of my grumpiness at this point, I'd say then there's the politics. So I hinted that politics was important, but I would argue that trade isn't just an economic tool anymore. It's actually being used as a means of avoiding military conflict. Because if you look at what has happened with trade policy over the last 18 months, 2 years, the language around trade has become increasingly weaponized. We've started to see trade being used as something to protect, to defend, to fight. Even in this country, we've seen in the Brexit, forgive me, debate, enemies across the table. We are seeing this whole language weaponized. Why? Because it's a much easier way to have a trade war, a quick and easy to win trade war, to coerce and influence foreign governments than it is to put boots on the ground. So in a multilateral, in an era where multilateral engagement has actually been expensive and become less popular, we're beginning to see trade used as a tool of national security as well. And it's not just national economic security. If you look at the US government's trade strategy and national security strategy, trade is at the beginning, the middle, and the end. All of this is happening because we're beginning to see a major shift in the technology base of the global economy. So why are China and the United States, and actually I would include Russia in that as well, beginning to fight about trade and trade policy? It's because they're trying to control the new technological paradigm that is emerging, that's trade finance, digital trade. The banks are actually regulators in this space. They are the organisations that are regulating, and if you like, almost foot soldiers in this space. And we're beginning to see the world of the internet separate out along east and west lines. So there's a lot of conflict in terms of sanctions, in terms of who we do business with in the technology as well. So just to summarise then, I think there are a few key things that are propelling recession at the moment. The strength of the dollar, emerging market debt, failure of global monetary policy. I will let my colleague here maybe talk about that. But I think, will there be a recession caused by a trade war directly? I think the short answer to that question is no. And the reason why is not because there are tensions there are, but because the economic consequences of triggering a full-blown trade war are actually to collapse our economic system. So America has already threatened to shut down the financial networks and access to markets by Chinese businesses and by Chinese government. What's the obvious nuclear button response to that by the Chinese? We will sell US treasuries. And so if everything goes all at one go, the whole economy goes all at one go. For me, that is the economic equivalent of pushing the nuclear button. I'm ever the optimist that I think in game theory terms, we're beginning to get to some kind of a stalemate in the same way that we did with nuclear policy. And so, while I might be saying that there are huge risks to the global economy, instead of it being the economy stupid, as Bill Clinton memorably said in the run-up to one of his presidential elections, it's not the economy stupid anymore, it's the policy stupid. Thank you very much.
What can I say after these two brilliant presentations? So, first of all, I would like to thank everybody for coming here, especially our students. The reason for this seminar to be held. Thank you for the Student Union for organizing this and for your hard work. Thank you for fellow colleagues and fellow academics who travel from far away in the country to be among us. Lord Haney, Dr. Rebecca, thank you for your presentation. I don't have new ideas after these two presentations, but I'll be playing now the role of the econometrician just to show you some indication of what has been said. So I'll start quickly with some fundamentals for the students to remember that what we're seeing today has been already said by economists, not politicians. So I pay tribute to two major economists that I have a lot of respect for. So I'll go after that to global equity markets and show the importance of the US. As Dr. Rebecca said earlier, I'll kind of show you some data on the China and US, what's going there, without trying to make any judgment or comments. I'll move to the Treasury yield curve to see what's been happening there, and then we're going to move to the central bank size that is worrying the rest of the world and a lot of us. We talk about consumer credits mainly in the US to tell you that yes, it's not that bad there. We had some signals, I don't know whether they are right, wrong, but we had some signals from the repo market and the Japanese. We're not talking about the Chinese debt market, but we're talking about the Japanese debt market. That is strong mutations are taking place there, and it can be some worries coming from that. I cover something that I think trade policy is a question of national and international security matter in addition to energy. So energy is also something that is important. I will cover kind of the commodity index in comparison to financial assets to show how trade has been very active with not enough economic growth, same for energy consumption. So that these are interesting deflators that are shifting the economic theory, and we need to think now how should we keep these economic fundamentals in a different context. Petroleum assets, what Puyani said to the governor of Bank of England a couple of years ago, still a big question that hasn't been answered. I'll end with the technology and the innovation effect that you have already mentioned, and probably with the future and possible solution, because I don't think I have solutions, and I don't think that quick ones we have cans that markets can stay irrational longer than we can stay solvent. So he said that a long time ago. As far as you pump in money, you cannot keep your economic rationality. And that's a common sense, which is not that common, unfortunately. He said also the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from old ones. So if we keep the same way of thinking and the same material of reflection, we will not have a different answer. So our challenge is to think differently. That's somebody who's great in asset pricing and in market behaviors. And Minsky. So Minsky, he came with 2 theorems for the students. I don't know if you've seen this in your class already. So he's talking about the financial stability or instability hypothesis, saying that financing regimes under, which is stable, and financing regimes in which are unstable. And pumping money, printing money into economies is something that is unstable. We know that. And the ECB, I agree, you will see this later, the ECB is in a much more difficult situation than the Fed. And the Fed, they have had some buffer in the last 2 years. They are in a better situation. So, say for Bank of Japan, they are in a much more difficult situation because they've been injecting instability through stability. Let me find make sense. The second one is saying that be careful, too much stability will create unstable system, and that's what has been said. So you have another guy that is amazing. So three things on the practical side, we shouldn't confuse value and price. So value is what you get, the price is what you pay. And this is, you will see this in some investment speculation. The line is very thin. Are we in investment? Are we in a speculation process? And the third one is, what I always say to students, is the time. So the only judge that's going to judge us is time. So that's why Andy was extremely right to say, I don't know about 2020. Because, otherwise it's going to be, So this is what happened on price-earning ratio. So it's quite, in the US, it's just above 20 for S&P 500. For the top companies, it's below 20. So you see there is a spike there in 2007. Yeah, that's fine. So quickly, I will go the hugest gap, guys. So that's what I always teach to students. So look at the NASDAQ in the last 10 years. So the US market tripled in size. Look at the FTSE and the CAC 40. So if we correct inflation and currency, you would have been, if you invested in those indexes, you would have lost a lot of money. S&P is somewhere around 200%. So this is, as consequence, we depend on the United States more than ever. So who is the second biggest market is China and Hong Kong. That's why the US got angry. And they don't want that to be closed because, as you mentioned rightly, the global market capitalization today, I can tell you, more than 50% depends on the United States. So that's in terms of number. In terms of efficient, strong, rational market, probably we are about more than 60%. And then you can argue stock traded as percentage of GDP. As you can see, that's a figure that is around where we are. So we got, that's so you can see this is going down again. If it goes down further, it's not good. But this is the first, if you look at the top, so this is the number of stock, market capitalization to GDP, so that is quite increasing. It can be misleading if you take this graph only. Why? Because you need to look at the value of the companies, which includes the intangibles. And if you look at the values of the companies, it's not that worrying. And who has the most of the intangibles in the world is the United States. But China is very far away, and I think that's what Donald Trump, that's not his job basically. So he tried to oppress China. China is a serious candidate. So as China had Huawei, and he tried to oppress Huawei. As a result, today Huawei got much stronger because he created this, and they did the same error they did in the 50s with the Soviets. And the Soviets got national priority is to develop the space technology. So this is what he did actually. So he committed a serious error there because Huawei now is a world-class company, and that's what you stuck with. So that's as I said. So in terms of value to GDP, it's not that bad. It's not that bad because the American companies, you all use Facebook, Mac, Apple, Microsoft, etc. So don't take the first graph on its own. This is what's been happening, a lot of frictions, declarations, you can see deal delay, massive correction on the S&P. It's a part, as Dr. Rebecca said, it's part of a war. So I hit you, you hit me, there is a correction in the short term, but at the end of the day, it's a loss-loss situation because it's a war, and in a war, you cannot be a winner. This is basic economic theory. So this is a short term, what's been happening, short-term volatility. I'm not very much interested in that. This is a trading figure. It's been supplied by a trading company. This is what's been happening over the past couple of years since Trump came to office. So the US had a lot of capital in, out, in, out, in, out. China de-investing, China buying TVs. That's exactly what Dr. Rebecca said. It's not good. A lot of uncertainty. You can see. So and that's movement of capital doesn't send a good signal. So it shows that we are trying to make the system weaker, and that's dangerous. That's money out of China in the last, and it will be interesting to see what is the Chinese rich people, are they investing in China or they're taking money out of China? So that's the big question. It looks like that is money going out of China, and that you can see this 549 billion in the last quarter of this year. That's something new. Something is happening, as you can see. The US money is going into the US. So these figures are the interpretation. I don't know what happened in each quarter, but the figures are there. So this is the yield curve. So to see where global markets are around, very low interest rate. We can ask a question about, you pick up, let's say, if, they are around 1%, 2%. So, if not negative yields for many countries. So, this is the size of the central bank. We're talking here about, I don't know if you can see it on your slides, it's not clear enough, but you're talking about 35% of your global GDP of the European market. So you can see for the past 5 years, the size of the ECB has been increasing constantly, and there is no buffer and there is no economic growth. So the Fed has reduced the size of its balance sheet. They are increasing it slightly because of the repo problems, yes, but it's only 22%. So they are in a better situation. So this is the yield curve, how they're flattening it. I will not spend. That's the US consumer credit. It nearly doubled, but the mortgage-backed securities and the securitized assets have dropped. You can look at this data later. The Phillips curve doesn't exist anymore. So we have a high employment with no inflation. There are reasons behind that, because it's cheaper commodities, companies do not pay, we have zero contract hours. So we need to rethink the economic theory, and that we can have a debate around that. That's what happened a couple of weeks ago, a spike in the repo market, bad signal for me. They said there's a technical issue there. I'm not sure. So you can click on the link and you have the full story on the thing. So you are on the highest level there. So this is the Japanese. So now Bank of Japan is holding the Japanese debt. So the Japanese debt is not held anymore by the Japanese savers. That's dangerous. So commodity price is at the lowest level. You can see where we had spikes, or at the lowest level, that was 2000, the dot-com crisis, the financial crisis. So what's going to happen now? Something might happen. I draw your attention that we have a lot of bankruptcies in the oil and gas sector in the US. This is the number of filling produced by an interesting company, Hands and Bone. And this is the level of debt in the US for the oil and gas companies. Something, I think that the shift in the oil and gas sector will be, there is something that will happen. I'm not sure when, but that's structural. So the solution is the new generation, the way they think, the way they apply innovation. This younger generation, they think differently, they want to share things. They don't want to do what others have done or what they are supposed to do. I've been in France and I was amazed to see graduates from Grand École, they don't want to work in La Défense anymore. They want to do their own social enterprise project. They want to create, they want to have their own empreinte. That's the equity relation to trade. I think China has to have an equity in the world. It can't stay on a trade relationship with the world. And that's the big problem. And, but it's not up to Trump to solve that problem. He can't solve it. Clinton, yes, he tried. Obama, they did a good work there. As you mentioned, artificial intelligence must be at the service of the real intelligence and not the vice versa. Also, we need to measure the soft rather than the hard and shift from solid to gas. Finally, I think people, the picture is there is how the challenge is how to reduce inequality. And that's equality in material, equality in happiness, equality in knowledge, equality in intelligence. They have to be dealt with, and credit to Esther Duflo, who did great work this year's Nobel Prize. The conclusion is different. I'll end up with Samuel Goldwyn, a great artist. Very difficult to make a forecast, especially about the future. I would say, learn from the past, but you should also learn how to say we don't know or we don't know yet. That's my conclusion.
Thank you very much, panel, for a very, very stimulating set of presentations there. I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll maybe take them in threes and just wait for the microphone to come to you.
Yes, hi, I'm John Depp, Senior Lecturer of Fine Arts here. I have a question. This is a very complex topic, and I don't think it matters so much who the politicians are in this particular situation, because China got into the WTO on the condition that it would become liberal and more democratic, and I think that stopped maybe 10 years ago, and this trade, well, I would say the pivot to Asia was by Clinton, under Obama, and now you have the more escalation with Trump. So besides the trade war, there's also a lot of things going on in Asia with FDI. So you have the Belt and Road, then you have the Japanese, the Australians that are very, very nervous about how fast China is expanding. So they got, I think there's a new Blue Dot, it's called, so to compete with the Belt and Road. And then also the military spending has increased by 20% in Asian countries. So I don't think this is at all about economics. It's got to do with geopolitics. And if you look at Pakistan, China now has a route around Singapore to protect its oil routes. And India is very nervous. So I think it's more politics than anything. And I would say there will be a crash in 2020.
Well, do you want to take that while it probably sounds like one for Rebecca first of all?
So I think there's something very important that we need to realise here, and this is why I wrote a book called Gaming Trade. America and Russia in the whole post-war period have, you can see the textbooks now with pictures of a game of chess on the front. America plays chess, Russia plays chess. They don't necessarily use the same rules to play the same game, but winning is everything. Okay, so in America's terms, at the moment, I export more, you export less, I win, you lose. It's zero sum. Now, the problem with the Chinese is they don't play that game at all. They don't play the same game that the Russians and the Americans have got used to in the post-war era. They're playing a game of Go, which is about strategic influence. So for them, foreign policy is actually economic policy. So it is peaceful expansion, and they call it peaceful expansion across the Belt and Road. It is allowing, I heard a Chinese diplomat stand up only 6 months ago and say, we have too much surplus. We are just exporting our surplus across the Belt and Road. This is us allowing other countries to develop economically and in a way that China has done in the past. So they can benefit from China's growth. So they see it as expansion, but they see it as a benign expansion. Now the thing is that Chinese military philosophy is yin and yang at the same time. You can have war and peace existing at the same time. So this means that economic policy is actually a critical part of their foreign policy. The problem with this in the United States with an equivalent, and it has now come into national security strategy, the difference is that it's about winning. It's about making America great again. So it's a much more belligerent rhetoric. A lot of that, and I mean, really we could talk about this all evening because it's come from the inequality that you spoke about at the end. It's come from that sense of disconnection, the haves and the have-nots in the West that have allowed protectionism, that have then allowed everything to the nationalist governments that have then created this conflict. We were happy with that, and the problem is we were happy with Chinese expansion until 2012, 2013 when Xi came to power. At that point, the language started to be less hide your light, bide your time. It came to be less and more about Chinese becoming great, China becoming great again. And I think we need to understand Chinese strategy in order to be able to understand how to go about playing the game with them.
But I think, if I could just add a point to your question, the need to bring the Chinese to the negotiating table to talk seriously about some of their practices, whether they're in relation to technology, theft, and a whole lot of other things, was absolutely obvious. But President Trump has chosen the wrong way to do it, because if only he had not been so determined to do it in a hurry, and if he'd only not been so determined to do it on a bilateral basis, there was a perfectly clear international coalition there waiting to have a discussion with the Chinese about this, composed of the Japanese, the Europeans, and the Americans. And if they'd done that within the framework of the WTO, I am absolutely convinced the Chinese would be giving ground now. And that's where we've got to get back to. Not say everything is fine and let the Chinese go on as they were doing before. That's not the answer. The answer is to try and find a solution to these problems within the rules-based framework. Now, what has President Trump done? President Trump has done one thing he must never do, which is to set up a win or lose situation. We all know, from those of us who spent our lives negotiating in multilateral organizations, there is one rule: everyone has to win. You don't otherwise get deals. And Trump has made it almost impossible for that to happen. And he's chosen an unfortunately extremely determined adversary in Xi, who's probably less prepared to be put down than some of his predecessors might have been. So it is a really dangerous situation that he's got into, made more dangerous by the fact that I don't think he actually understands it, which is always a little bit worrying, of course, when people go into wars about matters they don't really understand. So it is quite bad, but there is a way back, and the way back is to go back into a kind of multilateral world trade rules dialogue with the Chinese, which says you've really got to change some of the way you do things. And if you do that, we'll probably change some of the way we do things. That's the way to do it. Not trying to sell more soybeans to the Chinese. The Chinese will run rings around the Americans on these ridiculous concessions which will be doled out at some stage and which are frankly quite worthless. What's necessary is a change in Chinese practice.
I think there's a follow-up question, is there, from Motosam? Do you have a follow-up question, you must have?
Yeah. My name is Motosam Tatai. I'm from Regent University. I have a question for the panel. The situation in the world is, you explained and you mentioned a lot of good points about the trade and other things. I think when we try to assess the situation in the world nowadays, what we need to do is to go back to 2008 crisis. What happened in 2008 crisis is that the economic theory which was practiced by most of Western countries since 1980 onwards, it is known as monetarism, collapsed. We needed and we need now a new economic theory. We don't have it. And in my view, we should have one in order to find the right policy for the world economy's problem. I would like to know your idea on this.
So I'll very briefly answer that because I couldn't agree with you more. I think monetary policy has failed massively. I mean, we're in a ludicrous position where we are moving into a slowdown, we might be moving into a recession globally where monetary policy makers can't do anything. So I absolutely agree with you that monetary policy has failed. However, there are some areas of economic theory which can help us. So I come from the trade and actually a technology background, so I was in Scrooge for many years. My background there says actually the position that we're in at the moment is a shift in techno-economic paradigm. So we are shifting between the contralti of long waves, if you like. We have moved from an era where things were physical, and they're now moving into a digital space. Now, I don't know about you, but I, as an economist, am very, very scared by the amount of stuff we don't know at the moment. We don't know, seriously, how big digital trade is. We don't know how big, realistically, service sector trade is. We don't know how much of manufacturing supply chains are actually services. We don't know the internal pricing components of manufacturing supply chains and the things that are actually more to do with trade and prices. So much we don't know at the moment, to your point. And I think we have a theory to explain why we are in this situation. It's a shift in techno-economic paradigm. We're moving to a new techno-economic paradigm. I'd say my answer is actually a strategic answer to that, which is that we are also in an inevitable crisis of the last paradigm. Now, the 1930s, it was a war. I don't think it will be a military war this time. I think it'll be a digital war. I think it could be a financial war. It is a financial war. But ultimately, we're going to need a new theory of the individual contract with the state, because it is the individual that has its contract with the state that has now broken. The state isn't the provider anymore. There's a lot of economic activity that doesn't have a market attached to it. And how do we price the environment, which is actually the big challenge for a millennial generation coming forward? So I think you're absolutely right. I can offer you a description, as most economists can, and I think the answer is the theory of the individual's relationship with the state and how it associates with technology. Sorry, it's a bit longer.
agree more. I mean, in the 2029 crisis, you had somebody called Keynes that solved the problem for the rest of the world. And we are still being Keynesians, but the situation has evolved, demand has evolved over the complexity of the demand and the structural mutation and over changes over time have evolved. I cannot agree more. Now, the 2008 crisis, we didn't so, I think Minsky predicted that he left earlier. So he could have been somebody who could have brought you the solution to what you're thinking. Now, can you live, I'm going to ask you a question. If we remove the internet, so we define internet as the virtual world. I'm not sure it's the real world. So, if we carry on, and fully agree with Rebecca, if we carry on putting on the string of monetary policy, you're going to lose trust, and the major variable in economics is called trust. And if individuals, they're going to lose trust in the central banks, so you're not going to have any more central banks, you're not going to have any more currencies, and we've seen the bitcoins and the cryptocurrency, that's what has given birth to that. So you're going to probably have a currency of the internet, like the email is the post of the internet. So who controls the internet? What is it in the internet? These are questions that we don't have answer for. So I think I will go further. We need to redefine the contract between the individual and the community, and who is financing innovation. There is an economist, Maria Katsuki, she's Italian. She said in a simplistic way that all innovation has been financed by the state, etc. She's probably right, but the simplicity she presents the thing is not correct, because in the United States, yes, all project and the innovation are in two sectors, medical and military. And those two sectors are financed by the state. And who benefits from this is China. And China is copying at a cheaper price. This is not sustainable anymore for the rest of the world. So, the pricing innovation, pricing, as I said, intangibles, pricing digitalization, very simple. So today, any country around the world, if they would like to have a serious economic policy, so they need to be able to have a younger leadership. That's the first thing. More feminine aspect in the governance, so more ladies. And the third one, more digital control and more digitalizations. So China is not on this. Most of the countries that are underdeveloped, they don't want that. So that is a situation, but it's very difficult to bring people to accept that. So economic science is setting the model, but you need good politicians to apply the model with the society, but they need to know the society first. So that's it.
We have time for one more question, or we can do a quick round of questions. We promise to ask succinct questions the panel promises to do. So we've got one here, one here, and one here. So let's we start. You've got one.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm not an economist. Sorry, the acoustics in this room are absolutely dreadful. So I'm finding it extremely difficult to hear you. I'm sorry, and I also came in rather late, so I apologise for that. What I'd like to know is everything you're talking about this evening predicated on the assumption that we continue with the capitalist system that we currently have, or are you anticipating something entirely different? Because the problems that you seem to have been discussing remind me very much of Western colonialization of the East, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent. China is just doing to us now what we did to them from the East India Company onwards, so we can't really complain about it. But what I was hoping to hear was something about an entirely new world economic order, because without that, it strikes me, we're not going to solve problems such as climate change.
Excellent, thank you. Good provocative question. One here, and then we'll come to the final one here. Thank you.
My question is directed to Mr. Hannay. You inferred in your introduction that trade deficits are a bad thing for an economy, given the Vietnam deficit as an example. Whereas economists such as Adam Smith, which some consider as the father of liberalism, clearly stated in his book The Wealth of Nations that The balance of trade as an economic performance indicator is meaningless. Do you disagree with him on that point? Thank you very much.
Excellent. And one final one over here.
Yeah, hello. My name is Christopher Lambranius. I'm senior lecturer in finance. I think that there is a big gap here which we need to consider. You talked about the effect of politicians on world trade. And this is really true. There is this risk factor in the equation. However, at the same time, we have politicians who are extremely populists around the globe. And at the same time, we have economies which are really interconnected across the globe again. I think that the globalized economies today are quite globalized, but the politicians have no clue about that. And in some sense, they drive the game in a way to make sure that they are gonna make the electorate happy, but at the same time they are in a war. And the enemy is not there.
Okay, thank you. So we've got the end of capitalism, the endurance of liberalism, and the failure of democracy. Lord Hannon.
The first question, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I am not someone who believes that we need a revolution. I think we need incremental change, not a revolution. I've noticed from my study of history that revolutions tend to leave a rather large number of people dead before they're over, and I don't think that's a frightfully good direction to go in. I think in the 1930s there were those who questioned whether the whole economic model of capitalism could be made to work. They were proved wrong. Now, Adam Smith in Bilateral, I couldn't agree more with what you say. It is really Stone Age stuff to suggest that each country should balance its trade with every other country. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And thank heavens this country has never taken that view, and I don't think ever would, because we'd be in such a deep hole if we tried to do that, we would never get out of it. So I don't think so. The last question was just remind me
Populism.
Oh, populism. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about these populists who have sort of emerged in one or two countries is that they don't seem to have any solutions. If you look at Salvini or Orban, they don't have any solutions. They don't have any viable economic policies to propose. They just don't like the ones that they've got now. And they are making the most out of the aftershocks from the 2008-9 crash. The problem about that was that the immediate response of policymakers 2008 and 9 was infinitely better than it was in previous occasions, but they didn't take enough account of the aftershocks and of the inequalities. And that's what we've now got to address.
Okay, so to the first question, I remember as a student reading Rosa Luxemburg, and the thing that always struck me was that you can always find somebody to corroborate what you're thinking about. And Rosa Luxemburg stated very clearly that capitalism will collapse into local conflicts and integrations all the way around the world. And I guess what we're seeing at the moment is economic and military conflicts everywhere, and a lot of it is about inequality, unfairness. A lot of the geopolitics and the small level conflicts that we're seeing are in that line. So that's the first thing. Second thing to say is that yes, you're absolutely right to say that China is just basically borrowing. And Thorstein Veblen wrote a book about borrowing cultures and said that Japan and Germany were borrowing from America and Britain at the beginning of the 20th century, and look what happened there. We can see through history so many lessons about the situation that we're in now. And I think the biggest lesson of all is actually from the 1930s, because there was an economist who wrote after the 1930s crash and during the Second World War actually about the rise of Germany, talking about the link between populism, trade and interconnectedness, and I think this is absolutely the situation that we need to deal with now. I think we will be able to, I'm very optimistic because I think there's a new type of populism coming through, and I'll end on that. But to your point, yes, the world is interconnected. What's happened since the financial crisis? Economic growth hasn't picked up at the rate that we thought it was going to. So that's exacerbated the sense of haves and have-nots within Europe, beyond Europe, UK looking over at Europe, Europe looking at new accession countries, UK looking over to China. All of this sense that there are people in the world that have done better out of globalisation and better in the post-financial crisis recovery than they've done. So the whole rise of populism has been driven around this sense of unfairness. The reaction to that is absolutely the political narrative that we're seeing at the moment. Why? Because trade is economic nationalism is an easy narrative for a populist agenda. As I said earlier, I export more, you export less, I win, you lose, make America great again, make Britain great again, whatever you want to call it. It's about identity in the end, because the populist crisis that we're seeing at the moment is about lack of identity. The environment, we're out of control of the environment, we're out of control of the economy, we're in a period of austerity, it's all about change, technology change. We have an identity on the internet, not the same as the identity that we have when we look over the garden fence. So it's all about finding an identity. So we are fighting, to your question, we are fighting the battles of the last century, okay? Because that's what we understand. We're using trade as a proxy to fight those battles, because if we all marshal ourselves around a trade war, then we completely understand what we're talking about. We can have nationalism because that's a 19th and a 20th century argument, we get that. But of course then we get protectionism, so then we get slowing growth, so then we get populism, and we're stuck in that kind of a vicious cycle. So I think to answer, how do we break out of that? I am super optimistic about what a younger generation is saying. I think there is a new type of populism that's coming through that will drive an agenda. Unfortunately, we don't have a market for it at the moment. So we have to have a new economic theory, a new economic system to cope with the environment, to cope with capitalism with a Chinese flavour or Chinese characteristics. We have to have new ways of operating economically, because the politicians don't understand deliberately. Thank you.
Got nothing to add except saying that yes, I agree with both Hani. Revolutions and structural changes and destroying what you have, you replace it with something that you know is creating a chaos, and we don't need a chaos. I personally do not believe that equality equals fairness. We need to distinguish between equality and fairness. The definition of capital is not half capital, and that's my message. So to make a growth, I believe in two variables: C, capital, and time, nothing else. What is capital? It can be knowledge. That's what you are here, getting education. So you're building your capital knowledge. So experience, expertise, network is a capital. So capital is not your bank account. And over time, my supervisor, Anthony Barry, Manchester, used to tell me block to block in 3 generations. So if you are on a half capital and you leave it to the next generation and then you leave it to the next generation, statistically speaking, you go back to zero. So what can be transmitted over generation is the soft capital. And that's why you have interesting people like Warren Buffett, who gave away all his wealth, something like $1 billion. So that's because they understood that the pleasure is not to be on the top of the hill, but is in escalating the hill. And that's what the younger generation. I don't have the pretension to tell you what is the solution or what you should do.
Thank you. I'm very sorry that we have run out of time, but I think we can all agree this has been both stimulating and very intelligent discussion we've had this evening. We can continue that discussion over a glass of Chateau Regent, so please join us for a drink. But please join me in thanking, firstly, SEE, thank you to the Student Union, and most of all, thank you to the panel.